the really fun things I've gotten to do over the last 7 years is to work with Mike Zimmerman on organizing a series of lectures on anthropology, which we think is a great field and a field we ought to have here at Villanova, but we don't. So until we do, we'll just have to suffice with the occasional lecture on anthropology. Mike Zimmerman is the perfect speaker for a series on anthropology. He got his PhD in anthropology down at UPenn after a career, or during a career in pathology and in the field of medical field. He got his degree at Hahnemann and worked for
NYU.
I'm sorry, NYU.
NYU. I worked at Hahnemann. As much as anybody worked there, right? Stan was my chairman there, so.
Oh, now he knows. He meant to mention that along the way. Anyway, it's been a delight to work with Mike over these years. Now we get to teach a course, and we have a couple of likely suspects here in the class. So anyway, thanks for coming. And Mike's done some fascinating work on autopsies of mummies, and he's going to discuss those for us today. So, thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Lowell, and thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks for finding the room. It's a little upsetting when you get to a room where you're supposed to be giving a lecture and there's a whole class in there and the professor says, I'm here until 5:15, go away. But in any event, we've survived and everything's working, which is very nice. So I've been really fortunate because I've been teaching here at Villanova for, I think it's 7 years now, and taught a whole bunch of courses. Somehow they discovered that they really didn't have an anthropology department, and here was an anthropologist wandering on the campus. So I teach forensic anthropology and medical anthropology and human evolution, and Lowell and I teach this really wonderful course called The Journey of the Universe, which starts with the Big Bang and it ends with the future of humanity, and it covers everything in between. So we talk about the evolution. Yes?
Could you talk a little louder?
Sure. We talk about the evolution of animals and dinosaurs, and then mammals, and then human evolution, and then we once we have humans, we talk about the development, the origins of art, music, literature, writing, language. I have wonderful cartoons that, so if you ever take my course, you'll see all these great cartoons, like the origin of language is a caveman and his lady sitting on a rock, and she says, we have to talk, and he says, uh-oh. But anyway, so today we're talking about paleopathology, and specifically 20th century paleopathology. And but what's paleopathology? Let's bang this here. So paleopathology is a science of diseases which can be demonstrated in human and animal remains of ancient times. And this was by definition by Sir Mark Armand Rufer, who was a British bacteriologist and pathologist of some note. And he was sick. He had developed some illness, and nobody really knows exactly what it was. But in any event, he decided the best place to go to recuperate from this was Egypt. Have any of you been to Egypt? A couple of people. The last place that I would want to go to if I were sick would be Egypt. And but in fact, one trip that we've been there about 3 times working with archaeologic expeditions, and the last time we were there, we went to a place called the Dakhla Oasis, which is way out in the desert, and we had to filter all our drinking water, so we survived that all right. Then we got back to Cairo. We had to stay overnight in the airport Hilton, and I walked in. We had finished like a 12-hour drive from the Oasis. We were both wiped out, and I went into the bathroom and I brushed my teeth. That was it. Whole flight home in the bathroom. So, but in any event, Rufer, while he was there, he got very interested in mummies, and he not only came up with this definition, but he examined hundreds of mummies. So, and he developed a solution for rehydrating mummy tissue, which is basically the same solution that we still use. It's called, eponymously, Rufer solution. It's a compound. It's a mixture of water and alcohol and sodium carbonate, and it really does work very well, as we'll see in some of these pictures. And what does the paleopathology really mean? Paleos, these are Greek words, right? Greek words. Okay, paleo means old, ancient, and pathos.
Pathology maybe.
Well, it means a suffering.
Yes.
And it's the same root, you know, the English word pathos or pathetic, and it means suffering, so ancient suffering. And what does ancient mean? Well, for paleopathologists, it doesn't really have to be all that old. As I said, I teach forensic anthropology, and forensic cases really cover anything up to about 50 years old. Anything older than that is considered archaeologic, and they're not really interested in it. And some of the material that I'll be talking about today is not quite that old, but it's close enough. And also in paleopathology, it's pretty much anything that's all dried up. So, I've gotten this, I don't know, ill-deserved, well-deserved. Everybody knows I deal with mummies. So when somebody finds something all dried up, they call me up and they ask me if I can do something with it. And I've gotten involved in a lot of interesting cases, which we're going to be seeing here today. And here's the first one, and this is the tale of Elmer McCurdy, the life and afterlife of an American outlaw. And this was an early 20th century case. Elmer McCurdy. Elmer had a very brief career in crime and a much longer post-mortem career in show business. And he was born in 1880 in either Kansas or Colorado. It's not really clear which. And he drifted around that area. Finally, he wound up in Missouri, and he spent some time in Missouri as a zinc miner. And while he was there, he was I mean, it's really terrible condition. You can imagine what it was like being a miner in the early 20th century. And he started to develop some lung disorders. He decided that this was not really a good career line for himself. So he went into the Army, and he was stationed at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. And he was under a young lieutenant named Douglas MacArthur. And at this point, he developed some, MacArthur was involved with explosives, and Elmer thought this was really a good opportunity to learn how to deal with explosives. And he entered the Army as a miner, and he departed with experience in blowing things up with nitroglycerin. And this suggested his next career line, and his expertise in this area served him with some variable success in his next chosen career. He was discharged in 1910, and shortly thereafter he was arrested. He was walking around the street in St. Joseph, Missouri, with a bag of burglary tools and some nitroglycerin. And he was tried, and this was kind of a fiasco. He managed to convince the judge that these were really, this was an invention that he was preparing to make a tripod for a machine gun, and they let him off. So he now decided, well, maybe I better leave Missouri. He drifted into the new state of Oklahoma. You know, Oklahoma had been an Indian territory and had just become a state. And here he entered the really active criminal phase of his career. He joined the nefarious Jarrett brothers. These were a gang that were criminals, and they committed their first train robbery. And a pattern developed that was clearly to be repeated. Elmer, the reputed explosives expert, he not only blew up the safe on the train, but he also blew up all the contents. So all the money, was blown to smithereens, and the Jarrett brothers were not real happy with the performance of their new partner, and they got into a big fight. And at that point, Elmer actually was slashed on the wrist with a knife by one of the Jarrett brothers, and as we'll see, that plays a bit of a role later on in the story. But the law knew where the Jarrett brothers were. They knew these were a bunch of criminals, and they raided the Jarrett cabin, and they found nitroglycerin, dynamite, an assortment of burglary tools, and so on, that you really couldn't excuse as part of a tripod for a machine gun. So Elmer went off to jail, and he served some time in the Oklahoma Territorial Penitentiary. You know, we have a penitentiary here in Philadelphia, and I love the derivation of words. Penitentiary, it's not a jail, it's a penitentiary where you're supposed to be penitent. You're supposed to repent for your sins and get better. Well, that didn't really seem to work, because Elmer was released in 1911, and he continued his career as a bank and train robber with some varying success. In the spring of 1911, they robbed a Missouri Pacific train in Kansas, and they got a few dollars out of that, so they decided that they were going to go back to robbing banks. And they tried to blow up the safe in the Citizens State Bank in Chautauqua, Oklahoma. all they did was blow up the entire interior of the bank, just demolish the bank. They didn't get it. They just got a few coins that managed to survive this explosion. But they decided that maybe train robbing was really a better thing to do. So he got a couple of companions, and they decided to rob the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas train. It's called a KT train. And the intended target was carrying $400,000 in Indian tribal payments. When Oklahoma became a state, the federal government promised the Indians regular tribal payments in order to get their agreement to turning it from a territory into a state. So on the night of October 11th, 1911, McCurdy and his gang stopped the train on a very isolated stretch in near Okesa, Oklahoma. And this is a scene that was right out of a Western movie. And here they are riding up on horseback, and they overpower the crew. They detach the engine and the baggage car carrying the safe. They left the passengers stranded after this, holding them up with this stick up. Of course, these are not really the pictures from 1911. You know, the internet is amazing. Everything you want is on the internet. But in any event, they took the train. They went several miles down the track to collect their loot at a more leisurely pace. And to their distress, they quickly found out they had robbed the wrong train. The cash box on the train only contained $46. And the only thing of any real interest to them on the train was a shipment of liquor. So while they were on board, they drank several bottles of beer, and on their departure, Elmer grabbed 2 demijohns of whiskey. So the next thing they knew, 2 nights later, there was a posse on their trail. Here's the posse, a rather grim-looking bunch. And Elmer showed up at a place called the Rivard Ranch in the Osage Hills. This is in the eastern part of Oklahoma. Have any of you been to Oklahoma? Oh, good, a number of people. Okay, you know, we have this image of Oklahoma being this flat state and Dust Bowl kind of stuff. You know, it's just a lot of open space. But the eastern part of Oklahoma is really very hilly, and it's a very pretty area. And this area is described in the Oklahoma 8th, 1911 Bartlesville, Oklahoma Daily Enterprise as an area in which, quote, escaped criminals are able to disappear for days at a time, regardless of the advanced civilization made during the past 2 or 3 years. Ranches have been converted into farms in nearly every section of the new state, Oklahoma, with the exception of Osage County, where that district outside of the developed oil belt contains every element of wildness that it did in the old territory days. And that same paper described the final hours of Elmer's antemortem career. When he arrived at the ranch, again, quote, he had one of the jugs of whiskey taken from the train by the robbers and had been drinking heavily. He told the man at the ranch that he was Frank Amos, which is an alias, and that the whiskey had come off the train that was held up below Okesa. After drinking with the ranch hands for an hour, he asked for a place to sleep and was shown to the haymow, the loft in the barn. He had been asleep only a few minutes when the posse who'd been trailing him arrived. For 2 days arrived. They took their stations around the barn and waited for daylight. And Bob Fenton, one of the posse members, telephoned the Enterprise this morning. I'm really proud of this, by the way. I'm not really good with this. It's not working. I'm not great with. I can't see the red light from here, but well, you can see it. So I'm not, as I said, I'm not great with doing this fancy stuff with PowerPoint, but that's kind of fun. So Bob Fenton, one of the posse members, telephoned the Enterprise this morning about the fight. It began just about 7 o'clock, he said. We were standing around waiting for him to come out when the first shot was fired at me. His 2 Confederates surrendered right away. They didn't want to shoot it out. And the next, let's see, it missed me, and then he turned his attention to my brother, Stringer Fenton. He shot 3 times at Stringer, and when my brother got under cover, he turned his attention to Dick Wallace. He kept shooting at all of us for about an hour. We fired back every time we could. We do not know who killed him. On the trail, we found one of the jugs of whiskey, and that's a demijohn. that was taken from the train. It was about empty. He was pretty drunk when he rode up to the ranch last night. As you can imagine, drinking. I mean, this is a thing about this big, full of whiskey. So later that day, Elmer's body was taken to the Johnson Funeral establishment in nearby Pawhuska, Oklahoma, where it was to be formally identified, embalmed, and prepared for burial. A single bullet was found to have entered the right upper chest, so it came in here, traveled down through the chest and to the left, entered into the lower abdomen. And this is a tract that's explained by the fact that Elmer, in shooting at everybody, was lying in a prone position. So he's lying like this, and the bullet is coming like that. Hi, Drew. Grab a seat. I guess threatening my students if they don't show up really pays. So apparently Elmer, who had apparently consumed most of these 2 jugs of whiskey and then spent a cold night in a hayloft, he was in no mood to surrender peaceably when he was awakened early in the morning. Well, one of the techniques that was involved in, oh, here we are, I kept shooting there, we killed him. And here's Elmer in his coffin. Now, one of the techniques that was used for embalming people at this time was arsenic. Arsenic's a really good embalming chemical. Any heavy metal works. I mean, it's why arsenic works for killing people, because it poisons your respiratory enzymes. It destroys enzymes, and it also destroys the enzymes that result in the decomposition of dead bodies. So it's a great embalming agent. Got some hazards, though. Hasn't really been used since the 1920s because of the obvious health hazards of dealing with arsenic. And Elmer was embalmed in arsenic, and it resulted in the preservation of his body. And we see this picture taken in his coffin in the funeral parlor by the Guthrie newspaper. And Elmer's body was supposed to be buried, but you have to remember, this is in the early 20th century in rural America. They didn't have television, they didn't have radio, they didn't have telephones, they had not much sources of amusement. In fact, they still don't have a whole lot of sources of amusement. A number of years ago, I was offered a position in New Mexico, and we went to this little town where they had a hospital needed a pathologist, and we were told that the big excitement in town was to go Saturday night to watch the cattle auction. So, needless to say, I wound up at the University of Michigan for a few years instead of that. But so what did they do? Elmer had no known relatives, and the funeral parlor director, his name was Joseph Johnson. Instead of burying him, he kept him in the back room of the funeral parlor, and for a nickel, you could go there on a Saturday night, and you could see the body of Elmer McCurdy, the bandit who wouldn't give up. And this went on for several years. Remember, this happened in 1911. In 1916, a gentleman came into the funeral parlor, paid his nickel, went to see the body, came out shaking and crying. "That's my brother lying in there. And I want to take him back to Kansas. We'll bury him in the family plot." And of course, what the undertaker was doing was kind of illegal. You're not really supposed to exhibit bodies. So he said, "Oh, certainly, take the body, please. I'm really sorry but I'm glad that we preserved the body so that you could give him a decent burial." So off Elmer went in the company of this man who wasn't his brother. He was a barker in a nearby circus. And this was the Great Patterson Carnival Show up in Kansas, in Arkansas City, Kansas. And Elmer then began his long career, post-mortem career in show business. He toured the western states in sideshows for many years, and he finally landed in the Laugh in the Dark Fun House at the New Pike Amusement Park in Long Beach, California, where his post-mortem career came to light in 1976. And this was the way this happened. There's show business, and here's the Laugh in the Dark Funhouse. And what happened is that you may remember there was a TV program called The $6 Million Man, starring Lee Majors, Farrah Fawcett Majors' husband. And he was a soldier or something who had been severely injured, and they made him sort of a bionic man, and they invested $6 million in him, and he solved all sorts of crime and so on. So they were filming an episode in the Laugh in the Dark Funhouse. And this is one of those places where couples go in and the girl gets scared and the guy gets a chance to really hug her. It's all very tame now. But in any event, there was a dummy hanging in the corner. And this dummy had been painted with a phosphorescent red paint, and when they switched an ultraviolet light on it, it glowed in the dark. So the director thought that it wasn't quite in the right place. He asked one of the helpers there to move this dummy. They went to move the dummy, and the arm broke off. And there was a bone sticking out of it. And it became apparent very quickly this was not really a dummy, it was a mummy. And the police were called, and they questioned the manager of the funhouse, and he was rather disconcerted to find out that what he had thought was a dummy was really a mummy. The mummy was then transported to Dr. Thomas Noguchi's Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. Dr. Noguchi was very well known as the coroner of the stars. He autopsied Marilyn Monroe, Robert Mitchum, a bunch of other Hollywood types who came to bad ends. And Tom had the body x-rayed, and it was apparent that not only was this really a human being's body, but he was also a homicide victim. There was a bullet, part of a bullet in the chest. And the studies showed that this was an adult Caucasoid male with a modified Y-shaped incision. For embalmers and pathologists, in order to open body up, we make what's called a Y-shaped incision. You make cuts like this and then one like this. You just open everything up. And but embalmers, in addition to that, funeral directors, they make incisions in the inguinal areas, and they inject their fluids into the blood vessels in that area to embalm the bodies. And what was found when they opened up the body, first of all, the abdominal and chest organs, they're all hardened to stone-like consistency. But there was a gunshot wound in the right anterior thorax with a track that went down through the right sixth rib, the right lung, the diaphragm, the liver, and the intestine. They didn't actually find a bullet. The bullet apparently had gone all the way through and had fallen out, but there was a what's called a copper bullet jacket or a gas check. And I'm not really a great ballistics person, but apparently at this time, back in the early 20th century, bullets had some sort of a cover on them that was called a gas check. And in fact, they were able to tell that it was a .32-20 caliber with 6 right rifling. So all of you ballistics experts in the room now know what that bullet was. But manufacture of these bullets was discontinued before World War II, and gas checks were introduced around 1905. So we had to narrow it down to a time span between 1905 and about 1935. And when you add, and very high levels of arsenic were found in the tissues. So when you add this together, this being a practice that was discouraged in the 1920s, so now we've narrowed this down between 1905 and 1925 or so. Meanwhile, the Long Beach Police Department continued to question the funhouse manager, and his consternation at learning that his exhibit was an actual human body turned into utter dismay when he found out that it was a possible homicide victim. He told investigators that this mummy had been displayed until 1971 in a coffin in the Hollywood Wax Museum, another concession in the amusement park. And then he took over the mummy, which he thought was made out of paper mache, when the museum operators defaulted on their rent. But within a few days, it was established that the mummy had been a starring attraction in a number of traveling shows. He traveled the equivalent of around the world, and he was viewed by thousands of people in exhibits in Louis Sony's Museum of Crime, Kraft's Carnival Circus. But somewhere along the line, the fact that this dummy was really a mummy kind of got lost. At one point, he had been scheduled for permanent exhibit at the, quote, the haunted house in Mount Rushmore, but it was rejected as not being sufficiently lifelike. Well, his long career in show business finally ended in the Laugh in the Dark Funhouse in 1976, and he was kind of like a lot of his more famous Oklahoma contemporaries: Will Rogers, Tom Mix, Gene Autry, Woody Guthrie. Elmer had followed the Sawdust Trail to Movie Land, and he hung around Hollywood for a few years, and he finally got his big chance. But unlike these other people who had very successful movie careers, his big moment when he finally was a guest, had a guest shot on $6 Million Man. he blew it, and he literally went to pieces on the set. But within a few weeks after the autopsy, a very strong chain of evidence based on old documents and interviews with his former owners linked the mummy with the Oklahoma outlaw. We didn't have a ante-mortem physical description as a base for a positive identification, and he had no next of kin, so he faced consignment to a crematorium under his official LA County Coroner's case number, which was 7614-812 Doe John, critical number 255. It was the 255th John Doe they had that year in Los Angeles. So it sounds even worse than Philadelphia. Although we're trying, we're shooting people every day here in Philadelphia. Many people, I'm sorry, where are we? Well, luckily word of his predicament had spread to Oklahoma. And Oklahomans, they deal rather harshly with local lawbreakers while they're alive. Mostly they, string them up. But they get very sentimental about them 50 years or so after they've been dead. And many Oklahomans still remember the Dust Bowl days. If you've read The Grapes of Wrath or seen the movie with Henry Fonda, you know that Oklahoma, the Okie migrants to California, were not very well received. And Elmer was not the first local boy to be treated shabbily on the West Coast, so sentiment really favored bringing him home. And local historians in Oklahoma combed all the newspapers and the court records of the period, and they found Elmer's physical description and mugshots made when he entered the Oklahoma Territorial Prison. He was at that time 31 years old and 5 feet 8 inches tall, but there were no dental records or fingerprints available. There were 2 photos of Elmer taken in Pawhuska after his death. The first was the one we saw. It was a full-length frontal pose showing him actually before the embalming and still wearing the clothes in which he was shot. And the second one was taken after embalming, was a profile view showing Elmer dressed in a black suit and laid out on a bier. And both of them were labeled with Elmer's name and the name of the photographer and the date. And apparently these were used not only to help identify Elmer formally back in 1911, but so the deputies could claim their reward, but they were also either passed out or sold as souvenirs of the occasion. And again, remember, this is before the days of television when you could watch World War III on your TV. So armed with this information, a committee of prominent Oklahomans contacted Dr. Thomas Noguchi, who the LA city and county coroner, regarding the possible release of the body for burial in Oklahoma. And Tom agreed that this could be done, providing that a review of the available descriptive data by a team of experts could convincingly establish the identity of this mummy as Elmer J. McCurdy, and that if he was going to be returned to Oklahoma, that he would be given a decent burial. And this is when they called the Paleopathology Association, which I'm a member of, and actually a charter member, and somewhat to my concern, I'm afraid that I've been nominated to be president. I'm hoping I don't get elected. It's a big job. But in any event, we were asked to examine these remains, and what we found was that this was a mummy, about a thin Caucasoid male, about 30 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall. Mummies shrink a little bit as the tissue dries out. In Elmer's prison description, there was a scar 2 inches long on the back of the right wrist. And it was hard to see because of the shrinkage and wrinkling of the skin, but there was a very slender scar running across the back of this mummy's wrist. And apparently this is a residual of Elmer's fight with those nefarious Jarrett brothers. Then the facial profile of the mummy was compared and superimposed, I should say, on the photo of Elmer taken shortly before his death. So, and I actually don't have the side view, but here we see the frontal view, and you can see that they pretty clearly resemble each other. This is they use a forensic medicine superimposition technique involving 2 video cameras, and you circuit it through a special effects generator into a single picture, and that just superimposes one right on top of the other. So if we had that, you would see the perfect superimposition of these 2. So it was immediately evident that Elmer's face and the face of this mummy were remarkably coincident, and that supported all the other evidence. These findings, compared with the ballistic evidence, the use of arsenic, which was outlawed in most states by 1920, and the bullet track, matching the description of Elmer's fatal wound, established his identity. And the testimony of these several carnival and amusement park operators who at one time or another over the years exhibited this mummy allowed the piecing together of this 56-year odyssey that took Elmer from his funeral parlor in Pawhuska to the fun house in Long Beach. And of course, pathologists, we do microscopic examinations. Well, we look at organs, and then for pathologists, the reality is what you see under the microscope. So but this is a gross specimen of Elmer's lung, and it's extraordinarily well preserved. All those black kind of areas are blood vessels, and the actual air spaces are the smaller spaces in between. And here's the bullet track, that red line. The red line running through here, there and there. This is the same piece, it's just split open like this. So here's the bullet track through the lung, and his lung had collapsed. The medical term is atelectasis. And that's what happens when you're shot in the chest. The way you breathe is that your diaphragm goes down, and it creates a partial vacuum around your lungs, and that pulls the air into your chest. If you had to actually breathe by actively breathing, it would just wear you out in a very short period. So this is kind of passive breathing that we all do every day, every minute of every day. People have severe lung disease. They're always like this, and some of them, the medical term, doctors have a lot of funny terms. Pink puffers. Those are pink puffers. And the other ones who aren't getting enough oxygen, they're called blue bloaters. But Elmer, this would be a fatal injury when the lung collapses. We've seen this recently when President Reagan was shot a number of years ago. He was shot in the chest, and he developed atelectasis. His lung collapsed. He had the great good fortune to be shot in front of George Washington University Hospital. And they rushed him right into the hospital and did what you have to do in these cases, and he survived. And here's hemorrhage in his lung. This all this red stuff is blood from the bullet going through his lung. The arsenic's a tremendous preservative. This is a section of his skin, and I know most of you are not histologists, but this is the most on the. Maybe this isn't working. On the far left is the area is the superficial layer of the skin, and that little circular thing underneath it is a hair follicle. And this is his heart muscle, and shows those darker spots in the middle of each fiber are the nuclei. You know what? I don't have the arrow here either. All right. And one time or another in his life, Elmer got some bad pork, and he had trichinosis. This is Trichinella spiralis. This is the worm that you get from eating undercooked pork. And it's called spiralis because the larval form actually has kind of a spiral shape. So all these are all pieces of one larval form of the worm. It's just like this. So when you cut through it, you get multiple cuts. And here's a little higher power picture of this, well, now 101-year-old worm egg encysted in the muscle. So, and this is Elmer's last ride. Dr. Noguchi signed a California death certificate, and this cleared the way for Elmer's return to Oklahoma. But before he left California, the old trooper finally got his chance for the big time in the show business. This case had attracted a considerable amount of national attention, so correspondent Leslie Stahl taped an update for NBC's Evening News using Elmer as a backdrop. And
I have a pointer.
oh, well, I have a pointer too, but it just doesn't seem to project very well. Probably needs a new battery. Don't worry about it. Okay, so and everybody agreed that Elmer just did an outstanding, stellar performance. Oh, that's a lot better. Oh, that's the pointer I gave you. It's the same pointer, but it has a good battery. Ah, look at that. So that has to get a new battery. And Elmer arrived by jet in Oklahoma City on April 14th in 1977. He was met by a delegate from the Oklahoma State Medical Examiner's Office and taken to a morgue until final arrangements could be made for his funeral. And the expenses, including a modest metal casket and a tombstone, were covered jointly by the Indian Territorial Posse of Westerners, an organization of prominent Oklahomans interested in the state's rather colorful history, and by the Oklahoma Territorial Historical Society. And the next week, on a cold, rainy Friday morning, Elmer, accompanied by a mounted escort of the Oklahoma Territorial Posse, was taken in an old-fashioned horse-drawn hearse with glass sides and velvet curtains to the Summit View Cemetery in Guthrie, the old territorial capital of Oklahoma. This is not from the internet. This is a picture I took at Disneyland. But hey, you find things where you can. This cemetery is one of the oldest in the state. Contains the graves of several notorious outlaws and many prominent early pioneers and ranchers and politicians. And here's Elmer's coffin being lowered into the grave, and you see people are wearing their.
Sorry, we're trying to have a lecture in the other room, and we can't hear over your music. Could you turn it way down, please?
Is that just one person in there with music blasting away? Thank you. She's a scary person. her students quake in her class. Anyway, so here we are with our Western outfits and lowering Elmer's coffin, and they, at the insistence of the Oklahoma State Medical Examiner, Dr. J. Chapman, 2 cubic yards of concrete were poured over the casket, assuring that this restless native son would wander no more. And here's Elmer's tombstone, Elmer McCurdy, shot by sheriff's posse in Osage Hills, October 7th, 1911, returned to Guthrie, Oklahoma for burial in 1977. And here is the cemetery, and here's Boot Hill in Guthrie, Oklahoma. Here's Elmer, his headstone, his tombstone, and this is the tombstone of Tom Doolin. You may remember the Kingston Trio, Hang Down Your Head, Tom Dooley. I should have brought my banjo in. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley. No? Okay. Never mind. But the Paleopathology Association thought that Elmer really deserves a different epitaph, and they suggested, "Rest in peace, dear Elmer, beneath this oaky sky, where many an outlaw slumbers and politicians lie." They rejected that one. Well, the subject of the next study dates to the 1920s, and it shows that in the words of Sir William, I get involved in all sorts of interesting things. In the words of Sir William Gilbert in HMS Pinafore, things are seldom what they seem. It's skim milk masquerades as cream, and so on, if you've seen Pinafore. And art objects and curios can be composed entirely or in part of human or animal tissues and preserved by desiccation. And we can rehydrate these and examine them with a microscope. And I was asked to do this on a couple of specimens. One was a South American shrunken head, and the other was a skin-covered African crest. And a friend of mine had acquired this shrunken head, and he was off on a sabbatical, so he asked if I could take care of it for the year that he was going to be away while he was renting his house out. So we got this shrunken head home. I put it on the mantelpiece in our living room. Our cleaning lady came in the next morning, took one look, turned around and left. She said, "I'm not coming back till that thing's away." So we put it away. But my friend had asked me to check and see whether it was really authentic or not, because the Jivaro in South America were known to use sloth heads for practice, and more recently for the tourist trade. And about the same time, I was also contacted by a Museum of African Art in Indianapolis about the study of actually 2 skin-covered wood sculptures from West Africa. And pieces of these type were known to have been covered with human skin in the past, but the practice was thought to have been abandoned in the 20th century when they started using animal skin instead. So that's the thing. So here's the shrunken head. Looks pretty real, doesn't it? I rehydrated small pieces from the back of the neck of this creation and from the very small obscure areas in these 2 sculptures using Roofer's solution, the rehydrating solution. And what did we find? Here's the African sculpture. This is what's called a Janus figure, a figure with a face on both sides. And here's the piece from the shrunken head, and this is very clearly animal skin, animal hair. This is the hair. This whole thing is one animal hair. It's 3 times the size of a human hair, and it's very darkly pigmented. On the other hand, the tissue from the African sculpture was clearly human hair, human skin, because this is the same magnification. So human hair is much smaller and much less pigmented. So again, things are seldom what they seem. You never can tell quite what you're going to come up with. And the last study relates to someone from the opposite end of the socioeconomic spectrum, from Elmer McCurdy. In 1998, I was called upon by the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, and the FBI to participate in a study of some of the evidence of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And as you know, Kennedy was shot while he was in a motorcade in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. And with the exception of my students who weren't alive at that time, is there anybody in this room who doesn't remember exactly where they were at that time? I sure do. I was in the bank. I was an intern cashing my meager paycheck, and I remember thinking, well, if they just shot him in the chest or somewhere, he's probably going to survive. And as you know, it turned out he was shot in the head and did not survive. The official report of the Warren Commission was that there were 3 bullets fired by Lee Harvey Oswald, who was a mentally deranged Marine Corps deserter and defector. And again, as you know, he was killed several days later by Jack Ruby, which of course brings up all the conspiracy things that have been going on ever since then. Oswald's first shot actually missed. It just hit the bullet hit the pavement and it sprayed the spectators with gravel. The second went through Kennedy's neck, and then it entered the back of Texas Governor John Connally, who was sitting in the car with Kennedy and with their wives. And that bullet went through Kennedy's chest and his wrist, and it lodged in his thigh. And it was found, actually, when they took, and Connally survived, but when they took Connally to the hospital, the bullet had actually fallen out. It was lying on the gurney, on the stretcher, when they took him into the hospital. The third bullet was a fatal wound. That bullet through Kennedy's neck probably would not have killed him. And but what happened was that Kennedy, let's get this here. Okay, Kennedy was a war hero. He was the skipper of PT-109, and I'm sure a number of you have seen the movie. In fact, Cliff Robertson, who played Kennedy, just passed away. And PT-109, a PT boat, was run over in the middle of the night in Blackett Strait in the South Pacific by a Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri. And the PT boat was cut in half. 2 of the sailors were killed immediately, but the rest of them survived. And the front of the stern sank. The bow portion of the PT boat floated for several days, and the men sat up there on the front deck for about 2 days, and finally they decided nobody was coming looking for them, and they just thought they saw an island. There were several islands around there. Most of them were occupied by the Japanese, but one of them they knew was not occupied, so they decided they were going to swim for it. And Kennedy, who had been a championship swimmer at Harvard, towed one of the badly injured sailors to that island, about 3 miles. He took his life jacket straps and put them in his mouth, and he swam the 3 miles with this very badly burned and injured sailor. And Kennedy hurt his back, and that continued to bother him for the rest of his life. And you may have seen pictures of him. Well, you saw this picture of him as a young, thin man, and you all probably remember seeing him later in life and really kind of a broader face. He was on pretty high doses of steroids, of prednisone, because of his pain for his back. And he also had to wear a corset. So when he went on public occasions, he actually wore a corset. And when I was when I was in Washington doing this study, they actually brought his clothes out, and we saw the corset, and of course all his clothes were stained with blood and so on. And what happened? He was in the car, an open car, shot in the neck. Ordinarily, you get shot in the neck, you're going to fall over. But if you're wearing a corset, you're just stuck bolt upright, and all that Oswald had to do was take his gun and go like this, and just elevate it a tiny fraction of an inch and blow the top of Kennedy's head off. And that was, of course, the fatal wound. And fragments of the bullet that did that were recovered from Kennedy's body and from the floor of the car. Well, the FBI, back then in 1963, directed its efforts at the ballistic examination of the bullets, and they determined that it had come from Oswald's rifle. And then they put the bullets in storage at the National Archives in Washington. But there's been continuing interest, of course, in the assassination. And in 1994, then President Clinton established an Autopsy Records Review Board, the ARRB, headed by a federal judge. There are over 1 million pieces of evidence in the National Archives and documents relating to the assassination. And this is all due to be released to the public in the year 2017. It's only 5 years from now. And the reason for that is that by that time, sensitive information, such as the names of the CIA and foreign agents, will no longer really be of relevance. They interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, including all the Soviet spies that they knew were here. You know, the CIA and the FBI, they know all this stuff. And now it's worse because you have Easy Pass in your car and they know where you are. So the role of the AARB is to review requests for access to specific items and determine if they can be released because of the Freedom of Information Act. And they've released about 20,000 items of evidence. And one researcher asked to see the bullet, which have been kept in a sealed container. And he looked at the bullet. Thanks for coming, Boots. Have a happy time. Do good stuff. So he picked up this container with a bullet in it. He said, you know, there's something else in here. There were 4 little dark bits of something. And the people there at the National Archives thought these may have been fragments of tissue that really hadn't been noted at the time of the initial investigation. They called the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian called me. And I was asked to rehydrate these now, at that time, 35-year-old fragments and determine whether they were human tissue. Why do we want to do this? Again, it's because of all this business about what bullet did what. And they wanted to do DNA studies on this material if it turned out to be human tissue, see if A, it was Kennedy's or Connolly's, and B, if it was both, if it would tell one thing about the path of bullets, if it was just one of them, it would tell something else. And we did the way we did this, these specimens, oh, here's a Kennedy's PT boat. I build model ships too, so, and that's in my office, so if you guys come to my office, you'll get to see PT 109. Here's Kennedy with his bright blue eyes. I also have a model of the Beagle, so if you take my evolution course, you'll get to see Charles Darwin on the Beagle. So here are the 4 specimens, and here's an FBI agent who's going to do the actual handling of this. And these were tiny. I mean, here you can get an idea of how tiny this is. This was number 1. Number 2, little tiny thing. What we technically refer to as a ditzel. And number 4. So these tiny little bits of tissue. And here's the FBI agent doing this. And what he did was, we cut these in half and then took an even tinier little piece, because you only need a little tiny piece for DNA, so we took a tiny little piece out of the inside and put that right into a container for DNA analysis. And then I got the other half, and I was able to have that rehydrated. I gave them the formula for the rehydrating solution. I wasn't allowed to take it back to Philadelphia. Instead, it was taken over to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology there on the Walter Reed Medical Center campus. And because this was presidential material, 2 Secret Service men went with it. And they stood guard outside that laboratory for 2 solid days, 48 hours, while that material was in there to make sure that nothing happened to it. You know, Kennedy's brain has disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to his brain. And it's believed that the pathologist, the military pathologist who did the autopsy, destroyed the brain because he felt that people would be trying to steal scraps of it for souvenirs. So here's the judge. It's the man in the back here, and another FBI agent looking under a microscope at one of these rehydrated pieces. And the 2 ladies there are technicians there at the National Archives. So how did this all work out? Well, it turned out that this really was human tissue, and pretty clearly scalp. There was a lot of hair in it, and but not terribly well preserved. There, in fact, were some insect parts insects that had gotten into it. I could identify little bits of insect material. But the bottom line was that I was able to tell them this was human tissue and we should go ahead and do the DNA studies. And they did it, and it didn't work. And that's kind of the way things happen sometimes. You know, that's a lot of that happens in not just in paleopathology, but in medicine, where you get more than you would expect, but you don't always get as much as you would really like. And the reason that it wasn't that the DNA was not successful, of course, was because it was contaminated. This stuff had been handled initially, and then probably handled over the years in between. And the way the DNA system works is it always replicates the most intact DNA, which is going to be the most recent. In fact, when you run I ran a DNA laboratory in my hospital job in New York, and you have to even have a positive pressure lab. The air pressure inside your laboratory has to be higher than outside, so that if somebody's walking by in the hall and they sneeze, their DNA doesn't wind up getting into your lab and getting into all of your specimens. So and I'm not allowed to publish this, by the way. I wasn't even allowed to photograph the microscopic slides, and because this is all presidential stuff, I'm not allowed to publish it. Maybe in 2017 I will be. I'll have to contact the people down at the National Archives in 2017. So I did go back down there and I talked to them and I said, what are we going to do now? And they said, well, we're going to try and develop better techniques for DNA analysis. And I said, who's going to be doing that? And they told me top men are working on it. And they're already giggling. And I said, where's it going to be kept? They said, in a safe place, locked up. Top secret. Army intelligence, do not open. People starting to recognize what this is? A very safe place.
Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And here it is being tucked away in a safe place. And it's gone. And I don't know if we're ever going to see it again, but maybe in 2017. So that was my story of the involvement with the Kennedy assassination. It was an interesting experience, not the least of which was for working with the FBI. They are very serious people. I have one of my students took my forensic anthropology course last semester, and she's applying for a summer position with the FBI, and I had to fill out a letter of recommendation for her and a form, and the form said last name, first name, middle name, and she had only given me her middle initial, so I had to email her and say, Emily, I need to know your middle name. When you work with the FBI, you have to cross all the T's and dot all the I's. And in fact, when we were looking at these tiny little specimens, and we videotaped that whole thing, but nobody had a still camera, so I took those pictures, and I said to the FBI agent, these are really small, I'm going to have to blow these up. She gave me a look. I said, I guess you prefer the term enlarge. So it was an interesting experience, but until 2017, we're not going to know any more about it. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, for coming. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer them. Yes, Louise. I'm sorry, what?
To that 4-hour movie that I watched. Yeah, The Conspiracy.
Oh, no, oh, yeah, no, that, I don't think that there's any doubt that Oswald was acting alone, and Jack Ruby was kind of a crazy person. He hung around police stations all the time, and he was a great admirer of Kennedy, and he decided he was going to just take his revenge and be the judge and jury. Yeah, of course, yeah, lots of us saw that, yeah.
Michael, what about the ancient or Egyptian mechanisms for embalming? What fluids did they use, and how successful? Was it always routinely successful, or was it a question of heat, dryness, whatever?
Yeah, well, the Egyptians went through a long period of learning how to do that. They started out about 5,000 years ago, and all they did, first of all, it probably evolved because they buried bodies just in the sand in the desert, and if there was a sandstorm and the sand blew away, they would see there would be a preserved body, because the temperature in the sand gets up to about 150 degrees in the Egyptian desert. And but then they started burying bodies above ground, and of course they would put them in tombs above ground, and they would decompose. So they finally realized they had to dry out the bodies, and they initially they didn't take the organs out, and then of course the bodies would decompose anyway. They would wrap them, but if you examine the wrapped mummies from that oldest period of Egyptian history, they're just bones inside wrappings. By the about the year 1300 BC, they started removing the organs and desiccating them separately. And the way they dried the bodies out at that time, which is really pretty effective, is that they put the bodies, they had big tables, and they would lay the bodies down at a table and then put a mound of a material called natron, which is a mixture of mostly sodium carbonate and sodium chloride, just baking soda and table salt. And those would dry the bodies out. And then they would wrap them. And they would wrap them, they'd start by wrapping the fingers, and then the arms, and then the entire body. And those bodies really tend to be very well preserved. And in fact, that's what I've spent a lot of my career examining, a lot of those mummies and making a lot of diagnoses, because the tissues are really well preserved. And we know that this really worked, because a friend of mine actually made a mummy about, must be 10 years ago now, and he had a body donated at the University of Maryland Medical School in Baltimore. And he went to Egypt. He brought back a ton of natron. He had the tools made that the Egyptians used to remove the organs, and he did a full embalming procedure. And then he took all this stuff off the body, and he sent me samples of the organs. And the organs looked just like the organs from ancient Egyptian mummies. And in fact, I was able to tell him that this person had died in congestive heart failure, because the lungs were full of, showed evidence of that. So the ancient Egyptian mummification, once they finally learned how to do it, it really worked very well. But mostly it was desiccation. And poorer people didn't go through this whole big process. Those bodies would be just put out in the sun. And it's 120 degrees or so in Egypt in the summer, in Upper Egypt. And bodies dry out very quickly. We were working on, we were staying on one side, on the west bank of the Nile, and east bank of the Nile rather, and working on the west bank. And one morning we were walking to the ferry, and there was a dog that had died and was lying on the side of the road. By the afternoon when we got back, that body was totally desiccated, just sitting out in the sun for one day. So human bodies take a little bit longer, but desiccation is the major factor. It's just drying out. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Phil?
Two questions. How does the embalming fluid migrate to all parts of the body?
Yeah.
And are all parts of the body equally preserved with this embalming fluid?
Well, they took the organs out, first of all.
I mean,
then
modern.
in modern bodies. Yeah, no, they actually make cuts in major blood vessels here in the inguinal area, and they inject the fluid. And they inject it under some pressure. And it goes,
Circulatory system.
yeah, and it goes through the whole circulatory system. And it does preserve the bodies. I've only done a couple of autopsies on embalmed bodies where for some reason the body had to be exhumated, and they're very well preserved.
How does the tissue away from blood vessels be preserved?
Oh, the solution, well, blood vessels go everywhere. If you didn't have blood vessels in your fingertips would fall off. Okay, so there are blood vessels throughout your entire body, and that fluid, just because of the pressure, goes everywhere throughout the body.
Are there any areas where there are fewer blood vessels?
Not really. The only part that doesn't really get well preserved is the brain, and the brain kind of turns into soup after a while. But the rest of the body really does stay well preserved. Yes?
How about the arsenic then? Was that a powder or was it a fluid?
It was probably a fluid, a solution of
A fluid
arsenic that
solution.
was injected into the body, because he did have those incisions in the inguinal area. So that's standard embalming technique, is to open up those blood vessels and inject this stuff. And
But it's a fluid.
and it's always under high pressure to get that fluid everywhere in the body. Yes?
How were the bodies of Eva Peron and Lenin embalmed so that you could still see them?
I don't know about Eva Peron, but I'm pretty sure that Lenin actually has a wax coat on top of it. So he's really almost in a way, more of a model than the real actual body. So probably inside that wax dummy is the dried out body or the decomposed body. Eva Peron, I don't really know. Yes, Bob?
Yeah, every body we looked at, if you were to hold the body, it's very light.
Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't hold a it?
Oh, we're
Dry out.
about 85% water.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, so it's only, so I'm not as strong as I think I
No.
am.
No, you take a 150-pound body and dry it out, it'll weigh about 15 pounds.
Oh, okay.
We're really mostly hydrogen. But most of that hydrogen is in the form of water. Yes.
How about this new preservation method that makes everything like plastic?
Oh.
You know, like that exhibit that was at the...
Yeah, plastination. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was an exhibit down that we saw at the
Can you
front.
still access the tissue and analyze it, or is it
No,
basically
no,
just
that
turned into
tissue's all
plastic?
permeated by this plastic material, and you
never
can't really
analyze
do histologic examination. It destroys the microscopic structure.
You can't even see the hair follicles or anything?
No, it's all turned into plastic. It's kind of like, well, as we were talking this morning, fossils. You know, fossils look like bones, but they're rocks. It's the same sort of thing.
Uh-huh.
It's just replacing the structure by something else.
So you couldn't autopsy a plastic body?
A plastinated body, no.
Mike, what-
Unless there was a bullet in it. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting about cryogenics, freezing people. People still do this.
Yes.
apparently. I spent a summer freezing blood at a blood bank in Jefferson, and every time we thought it hemolyzed it. We
That's
couldn't
right.
do anything once
Yeah.
blood was frozen. So why do these people think that they're going to suddenly wake up in 200 years?
Well, the problem is not the freezing, it's the thawing.
Yeah, it's a
The problem is the thawing, is
Yeah.
that the fluids crystallize, and then when you thaw them out, it ruptures everything. And I guess the people who are doing the cryogenics are hoping that they figure out a better way of thawing out bodies in the future. And I think they also inject them with some kind of a sucrose solution, a sugar solution, that's supposed to prevent the crystallization. But I'm not going to do it.
Like when you freeze cells, individual cells, you do it in DMS cell.
Is that what you used? Okay, so that's a, what's the word I'm trying to think of? It's a dispersant or something like that. Okay.
Quite a lot of stuff.
Yeah. But the Egyptians know how to do it. Yeah.
There's a preserved body at Fifth and Allegheny, John Newman, founder of the Catholic school system in this country, I guess. I don't know whether he was embalmed or not, but he's in a glass case at Fifth and Allegheny. Anybody aware of that? Ever just seen that?
John Newman?
John Newman.
You're
It's
also,
Saint John Newman now.
I don't know.
And I'm just wondering what the process may have been accidentally to preserve that body.
I'm only guessing that he was embalmed, but I don't know when that. I don't know
Early
anything about it.
1800s.
Yeah, I really just don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know. There have been preserved bodies from time to time. There was a president of the British Medical Society, Jeremy Bentham, and his body was preserved, and he actually was put in his chair at board meetings there. But he was blown up in the Blitz, so he's no longer with us.
Could you,
in the entrance hall of
Could
the
you,
Royal Academy.
Stan, sorry,
Could
Stan?
you preserve the body by radiating it, the way you do food, and then just put it in plastic, so it puffs up?
Well, yeah, I guess if you radiate enough, you can activate all the enzymes that are in there and kill all the
Yeah.
bacteria and fungi, what have you. About 1974, Ramses II was brought to Paris because his mummy was being invaded by fungi, and they radiated it, and they killed all the fungi. And this has created a bit of a fuss now because in the process of radiating it, they destroyed all his DNA. And of course, at the time, we didn't have the DNA technology that we have now, and there have been a lot of studies done on Egyptian mummies. So we now know, for example, who Tutankhamun's father was and his mother and so on. And there's an article in JAMA last year about that. But you can't do that with Ramses II because all his DNA has been destroyed. He doesn't have fungi anymore, but he no longer has any DNA. Lose your DNA, you're in big trouble. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, thanks very much.